"You cannot have thought I meant to go through with it," Crispin Vale said, loud enough that the whole gravel forecourt heard him. "Not truly, not when there was Miss Pruett to be had instead." Godwin, Duke of Otholt, stood at the edge of the wide stone terrace about forecourt with a glass of untouched claret in his hand, and he did not move, though every servant and guest below him had gone as still as figures in a painting. He had come to Harefield Grange for 1 hour and one purpose, a matter of drainage across 2 shared meadows, a dull business he had meant to settle with the elder Mr. Pruett and be gone before the noon bell, and he had walked out onto the terrace only to escape the noise of the drawing-room. Now he found himself the unwilling witness to a thing he understood far too well, and the claret sat forgotten in his hand while a young man in a bright new coat destroyed a woman in front of 40 people who had come to eat cake. The young woman stood at the foot of the terrace steps with her back very straight. She wore grey, plain grey, unadorned, the sort of gown that a girl kept good by keeping it careful, and a small posy of white flowers had been pinned at her breast, evidently by someone who had thought this a morning of celebration. She held her chin level. That was the thing Godwin noticed first, before he noticed anything else about her, because in his long and guarded experience, women who were being ruined in public did one of 2 things. They wept or they raged, and both were a kind of surrender. This one did neither. She looked at Crispin Vale as though she were memorizing him, so that she should never make such a mistake again. "Mr. Vale," she said, and her voice did not shake. "You will want to say the rest of it plainly, so that no one here has to guess." "I have said it plainly enough." Vale glanced sideways, and Godwin followed the glance to a knot of finely dressed people gathered near the fountain, and to the woman at the center of them, a handsome, high-colored creature in rose silk and a great deal of gold, who was smiling behind her fan in a way that told the whole story before a word of it was spoken. Millicent Pruett. Godwin knew the name. He had come, after all, to treat with her father over ditches. He had not known until this instant what the family had lately purchased with its money. "Miss Pruett and I have an understanding," Vale went on, warming to himself now, "and her father is generous, and I am not the sort of fellow who can afford to be sentimental. You are a sensible girl, Malona. You have always been a sensible girl. You will see the wisdom in it once the sting is past. Malona." Godwin turned the name over without meaning to. It suited the grey gown and the level chin, a plain old, unfashionable name, the kind that did not try to be anything it was not. "I see the wisdom in it now," she answered. "I only wonder that a man who cannot afford to be sentimental could afford the ring you gave me in April. Or was that borrowed too, against Mr. Pruett's generosity?" A ripple went through the forecourt, a few indrawn breaths, one badly stifled laugh from a footman who was cuffed for it at once. Vale's face darkened to the shade of his own waistcoat. It was not a shriek, not a plea, not the tears he had plainly been braced to weather and enjoy. It was one quiet, exact remark that laid the whole cheap architecture of him bare in a single sentence, and it landed the harder for the softness of the voice that delivered it. Godwin, who had spent 20 years learning to say precisely such things and to feel nothing while he said them, felt something move in his chest that he did not care to name. "Take back the ring, then," Vale said thickly, and worked it. No, he could not, for she had already drawn it from her finger while he floundered, and she set it down upon the flat stone ball that capped the newel of the terrace steps, gently, as though laying a coin on a dead man's eyes. "There," Malona said. "It never fit. I told you so in April, and you told me I would grow into it. I find I would rather not." Godwin had attended a great many humiliations in his time. He had presided over some of them himself, in council chambers and card rooms, and had learned to gauge such things the way a horse dealer gauges a fetlock, with a cold and practiced eye. By every measure he knew, this one ought to have gone the other way. The young woman disgraced, the young man vindicated, the crowd's sympathy flowing where the money flowed, as it always did. Instead, he watched the forecourt's mood turn against Crispin Vale like milk, watched the finely dressed guests glance at one another, and then uneasily away, and he understood that the girl in grey had somehow won a contest she had not even consented to enter. She had done it without raising her voice. She had done it, so far as he could see, simply by declining to be small. He had not known until that moment that such a thing could be done. He had spent 11 years believing that dignity was a luxury of the well-funded, and here was a penniless parson's niece spending it as though she had pockets full. She did not wait to be dismissed. She turned, not quickly, not in the ugly scramble of a woman fleeing, but in the unhurried way of a person leaving a room she has decided is not worth staying in, and she walked. Not toward the house where her trunk and her people presumably were, not toward the carriages drawn up along the yew hedge, where she might have begged a seat and a scrap of pity from some soft-hearted matron. She walked toward the open gate and the white country road beyond it, on foot alone, with nothing in her hands and the little posy still pinned at her breast, and she did not once look back. Godwin watched her go the length of the gravel and out under the stone arch of the gate, and he was aware that no one moved to stop her. That was the part that fixed him where he stood. 40 people, and the woman who had been the morning's honoured guest was walking out onto the high road like a discharged governess, and not one of them so much as called her name. Millicent Pruett laughed at something behind her fan. Crispin Vale picked up the ring off the newel post and put it in his pocket, and turned back toward the fountain and his richer prospect, as though a tiresome errand had been discharged. The party, after the smallest decent pause, began to breathe and murmur and drift again toward the cake. "Poor creature," said a voice at Godwin's elbow. It was the elder Mr. Pruett, come out to find his ducal guest, rubbing his hands in the manner of a man who has done a good stroke of business and wishes to be congratulated for it. "But there, no harm done, your grace. She's the vicary girl, the parson's niece from over at Coombe. No fortune, no family to speak of, only a grail of pride, which is the last thing a girl in her situation can afford. She'll do very well as a companion somewhere, I don't doubt. Now, this matter of the West Meadow." "Whose gig is that?" Godwin said. Mr. Pruett blinked. "Your grace, the road to Coombe. How far is it on foot from this gate?" "Why," Pruett scratched under his wig, 7 miles near enough by the low road, 8 if she keeps to the turnpike. "But your grace need not trouble himself over there. 9 miles of open country," Godwin said, more to himself than to the man, "and rain coming off the down before 3 o'clock. He had ridden and driven these shires all his life, and could read a sky the way other men read a broadsheet. And the sky over the western hills had already gone the colour of pewter. A woman in thin grey stuff on foot, with no cloak and no companion and 7 miles of hedgerow between her and whatever cold welcome waited at Coombe. It was nothing to do with him. He told himself so quite firmly, and found the telling did not take. He had a particular reason to want it to be nothing to do with him, and the reason had a name he did not speak even inside his own head if he could help it. 11 years ago Godwin had been another man, younger, warmer, foolish in the specific way of a man who believes his own heart is a reliable instrument. He had loved a woman named Cordelia Aldingham, loved her with the whole undivided force of a nature that did nothing by halves, and he had believed himself loved in return, up to the very week that a marquess with a larger fortune and an older title made his interest known. Cordelia had wept and been sorry and married the marquess before the leaves turned. Godwin had learned from it the lesson that the world took such pains to teach, that affection was a currency, that a heart could be outbid, that the tender feelings a man permitted himself were merely the price he paid later, in coin, at compound interest. He had closed the ledger of his own heart that autumn and had kept it closed for 11 years, and the keeping of it had made him rich and powerful and much feared and entirely, deliberately alone. Men called the Duke of Otholt cold. He did not correct them. It had cost him a great deal to become cold, and he was not minded to squander the investment on a parson's penniless niece he had watched for 4 minutes over a terrace rail. And yet he had watched her set the ring down as though it were a small dead thing, and he had watched her walk out under that arch with her chin level and no witness to praise her for it, and something in the sealed ledger had shifted like a book slipped loose on a crowded shelf. "The meadow," Mr. Pruett prompted hopefully. "Send your terms to my steward in writing," Godwin said. "Otholt. He will know my mind." He set the untasted claret down on the balustrade. "Good day to you, but, your grace, you'll take some refreshment before you, the horses are hardly." Godwin was already going down the terrace steps, past the flat stone newel where the discarded ring had lately sat, past the fountain and the rose-silk laughter, which faltered and hushed as he passed through it, because feared men have that effect, and he did not trouble to soften it. He did not look at Millicent Pruett. He did not look at Crispin Vale, who had gone quite pale at the sight of a duke crossing the forecourt with that particular set to his jaw, and who no doubt spent the next several minutes persuading himself that it could have nothing to do with him. It did not, in fact, have anything to do with him. That was a thing Godwin would have occasion to make very clear to the young man later, and to enjoy the making of it, but not today. His carriage stood at the far end of the yew walk, black and unmarked but for the small silver device on the door, the horses fresh and restless in the close air. His man Brill straightened off the wheel at the sight of him. "Your Grace, I'd not looked for you this half-hour yet." "The Combe Road," Godwin said, and took the door himself before Brill could reach it. "The low road, not the turnpike. Drive slowly once we are past the gate, and keep your eyes on the verge." "The verge, Your Grace? There is a person walking." "We will overtake her." He heard the words come out of his own mouth and marvelled distantly at them, for he could not have said, if his life had hung upon it, what he intended to do once the carriage drew level with the grey figure on the road. A man of his years and standing did not chase a jilted stranger down a country lane. It was the sort of thing that got itself repeated in drawing rooms, embroidered at each telling, and he had guarded his name too carefully to spend it on a whim. He knew all this. He turned it over with the cold half of his mind even as the warmer half. So long disused he had half forgotten he possessed it, urged the horses on. Offer her a seat, he supposed. A duke's carriage to a parson's niece. She would refuse it, of course, out of the same pride that had kept her chin level, and he would have done the correct and Christian thing and could drive on to Otholt with a clear conscience, and the ledger safely shut again. That was the whole of his intention. He was almost certain that was the whole of it. Brill, who had served the house long enough to know when not to ask a second question, touched his hat and climbed to the box. The carriage rolled forward down the yew walk and out through the stone arch onto the white road, and Harefield Grange with its cake and its fountain and its cheap bright ruin fell away behind the hedge. He thought, as the carriage swayed down the lane, of the ring set so gently upon the newel post. There had been no theatre in the gesture, and that was what unsettled him. A woman playing to a crowd flung the ring, or pressed it back into the man's hand with a tremor and a tear, or let it fall to be scrabbled after in the gravel. There were a dozen well-worn ways to make a spectacle of a slighted heart, and Godwin had seen each of them performed by cleverer actresses than a country parson's niece. Malona Vickery had done none of them. She had set the thing down as one sets down a burden one is glad to be rid of, and she had explained herself in a single sentence about a ring that never fit, and then she had walked away before anyone could decide how to feel about her. It was, he thought, the conduct of a person who had long ago stopped expecting the world to be fair, and had resolved instead to be unashamed within it. He knew a very little about that resolve himself. He had made it, once, in a colder and more expensive form, and it had preserved him and impoverished him in equal measure ever since. The road ran empty and pale between hawthorn banks, rising toward the shoulder of the down, and the light had that flat and yellowing quality that comes before weather. Godwin sat forward with one gloved hand on the frame of the open window, and watched the verge as he had told Brill to watch it, and told himself again that this was a small charity, a thing any decent man would do, no more remarkable than lifting a fallen traveller out of a ditch. He was aware, underneath the telling, of a wholly unfamiliar sensation, and it took him the better part of a mile to identify it. So long had it been since he had felt anything of the kind. It was impatience. It was the impatience of a man who is afraid, quite unreasonably, that he may already be too late for something he has not yet named. Then the road bent around a stand of elms, and there she was. She was perhaps a quarter-mile ahead, a small upright figure of grey against the pale road, walking steadily with her arms wrapped about herself now against the freshening wind, the little white posy. He could not see it at this distance, but he knew it was there, still pinned uselessly at her breast. She did not turn at the sound of the wheels. A woman walked out of a broken engagement did not turn hopefully at every carriage, he thought. She had already learned this morning exactly what carriages coming up behind her were worth. She only drew a little closer to the hawthorn to let the vehicle pass, and kept her eyes on the rising road ahead, and kept walking, as she plainly meant to keep walking the whole 7 miles and into whatever waited at the end of them, alone, rather than turn and ask a single soul for anything. "Slow," Godwin said quietly. Slower still. The carriage came up on her at a walking pace, the horses blowing, the harness ringing softly in the hush before the rain. Godwin found that his heart was beating in a way he had spent 11 years ensuring it would never beat again. Not hard, but present, insistent, like a knocking at a door long since bricked over, and he did not draw back into the shadow of the carriage as a wiser man would have done. He leaned into the light of the open window, so that when she turned, if she turned, she should see his face and not merely the silver device on the door. The first drops of rain struck the road, dark coins on the pale dust, one and then another and then a scattering. And the grey figure on the verge, hearing at last that the wheels beside her had slowed to match her step and were not going to pass, stopped walking and lifted her level chin and turned. She turned, and Godwin saw her face fully for the first time, unframed now by the distance of the terrace, or the crowd, or the man who had been ruining her, and he understood that he had been mistaken to think he had already taken its measure. It was not a beautiful face by the reckoning of the drawing rooms. It was too grave for that, the mouth too firm, the brows too level and dark for a fashion that prized softness. But it was a face that a might look at and go on looking at, because it did not perform. There was no leap of hope in it at the sight of a gentleman's carriage, and no calculation either. There was only a wariness held under a great composure, the look of a person who has already been asked for surrender once today, and has resolved not to be surprised into giving it a second time. Her eyes found the silver device on the door, and then, above it, his face at the open window. He watched her place him. He watched her recognize in the space of a breath that this was the man who had stood on the terrace with an untasted glass in his hand while Crispin Vale did his work. The one great personage in that whole company who had neither laughed nor looked away, and he saw her decide that his presence here, slowed to her walking pace on an empty road with the rain beginning, could mean nothing that a sensible woman ought to welcome. Her chin came up another degree. The rain thickened, pattering now in the hawthorn, dark spots blooming on the shoulders of the grey gown. "You are wet through in 5 minutes on this road," Godwin said. It was not what he had meant to say, and it came out more bluntly than any address he had made to a woman in a decade. "There is room in the carriage." "There is," she agreed, glancing at it. "A great deal of room." "I thank you, sir, but I am very well as I am." "You are not well as you are. You are a mile from the Grange with 6 more to walk, and the weather off the down behind you." "Then I had better keep walking and not stand in it discussing the matter." A small thing happened at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile, the ghost of the same dry exactness with which she had asked Vale whether the ring had been borrowed. "You will forgive me, your grace. I do know who you are. A woman does not spend a morning at Harefield without learning that the Duke of Otholt is come about a ditch. But I cannot think it would do your name any service to be seen carrying home a person that the whole county watched turned out of doors an hour ago. I should not like to cost you that. Good day." She said it without bitterness, which was the thing that arrested him. She had named her own disgrace plainly, the way a person names the weather, and had offered his reputation more care than she seemed to be sparing her own comfort. And then she had made him a small correct bow and turned back to the rising road as though the interview were closed. Godwin was not a man to whom interviews were closed by other people. He was aware, with the cold half of his mind, that the wise course was to let her go, that he had made the decent offer, that it had been refused with more grace than he had any right to expect, and that a gentleman took a lady at her word and drove on. He heard himself instead say, "Stop." The horses halted. Malona did not at once. She took 2 more steps before the silence of the stationary carriage behind her made walking on absurd, and she paused and looked back at him over her shoulder with the rain running now from the brim of her plain bonnet. "I have offended you," Godwin said. "You think I mean it as charity, and you have had a bellyful of the county's charity this morning, and would rather drown than take another spoonful. Have I read you correctly?" For the first time something moved behind the composure, surprise, and then a flicker of something warmer that she put down again quickly. The way one puts down a cup one has been caught lifting too soon. "You have read me very nearly," she said. Though I would not have put it so unkindly to myself, I have not the habit of putting things kindly. It is thought one of my chief faults. He did not smile. He had lost the trick of it years since. But he shifted along the seat so that the door and the dry interior stood open and plain before her. No hand extended, no pressing, only the fact of the shelter offered without ornament. Then let me put it as a bargain, which you may accept without owing anyone anything. I am bound for Otholt by the low road which runs through Coombe. You are bound for Coombe. The rain is bound for both of us. I do not offer you rescue, Miss Vickery. I offer you a dry seat in a carriage that is going your way regardless, and the freedom to say not one word to me the whole distance if silence suits you better. You would be doing me no favor and taking no favor. It is only arithmetic. He watched her weigh it. That was another thing he had not seen in a woman in a long while, a face that visibly thought, that did not merely arrange itself in the expression a duke would wish to see. Millicent Pruett, he reflected, would have been in the carriage before he finished the sentence, and would have spent the drive telling him how vastly clever and how vastly kind he was, in the confident manner of a woman who had learned that flattery was a coin that always spent. This one stood in the rain and did him the discourtesy of considering whether he was worth believing. It is not only arithmetic, Malona said at last. You know quite well it is not, or you would not have troubled to dress it up as arithmetic. But she glanced up at the pewter sky, and a gust drove the rain flat across the road between them, and some practical calculation in her tilted the balance where his kindness had not. But I have got precisely one gown left in the world that is fit to be seen in, and I am standing in it. And I find I have too much vanity to arrive at my uncle's door looking like something the ditch gave up. That and no finer feeling is why I shall accept. I want it understood. It is understood, Godwin said gravely, and I honor the vanity. Come out of the wet. She came. She did not take the hand he did not offer, nor wait for Brill, who was climbing down. She gathered the sodden grey skirt in one competent fist and stepped up into the carriage as briskly as a woman boarding the common stage, and settled herself on the seat opposite with her back straight, and her wet bonnet dripping quietly onto her clasped hands, and looked about the dim interior with an unhurried, level curiosity that took in the good plain leather, and the silver-topped flask, and the fur rug folded on the seat, and appraised the whole without envy and without awe, as one notes the furnishings of a room one does not expect to sit in twice. Godwin rapped the roof. The carriage rolled forward into the thickening rain, and the small dry space between them, which a moment before had held only weather, now held the two of them, and a silence he found, to his considerable surprise, that he did not wish to keep. He reached the fur rug across to her. Your hands are cold. My hands are always cold, she said, but she took it, and drew it over her lap, and some of the rigid set went out of her shoulders in spite of her. Thank you, truly this time, and not as arithmetic. They rode a little way without speaking, the rain drumming on the roof, the hedges streaming past grey and glistening. Godwin, who could sit in a silence longer and more comfortably than any man in 3 counties, and had used the skill to unnerve better men than Crispin, discovered that this particular silence unsettled him, because he kept wishing to end it, and could not for the life of him recall the last time he had wished a woman would go on talking. He looked at the little posy of white flowers still pinned, bedraggled now and half drowned, at the breast of her gown, and something about its stubborn, foolish persistence there, a wedding favour on a jilted woman, riding in a stranger's carriage through the rain, undid a further catch in the sealed ledger of him. You may take that off, he said, before he had decided to say anything. The flowers. No one would blame you. She looked down at the posy as though she had forgotten it was there, and her fingers went to the pin and stopped. No, she said slowly, I think I shall leave it. My aunt pinned it there this morning with her own hands, and she was so happy, and she is going to be so grieved when I come home without a husband and with her flowers still on me, that it seems to me the least I can do is bring them back to her unthrown away. She will want to know I did not make a scene. A pause. I did not make a scene, did I? You were there. You will tell me the truth, I think, where the others would only be kind. You made no scene, Godwin said. You conducted yourself better than any person present, which is why they will none of them forgive you for it. A woman who weeps can be pitied and put out of mind by luncheon. A woman who does not weep is a reproach, and reproaches are long remembered. He heard the weight of his own knowledge in the words and moderated it. You asked him whether the ring was borrowed. It was very well done. He will hear it again in his sleep for a year. That won from her at last a real smile, brief, unguarded, transforming, and it did something to the grave face that made Godwin sit very still. That was wickedly said, and I ought to be ashamed of it, and I am not. The smile faded to something more tired and more honest. The worst of it, Your Grace, is that I am not even very much surprised. I had begun to suspect these 3 weeks that Mr. Vale's ardour cooled exactly in step with Mr. Pruett's improvements to his prospects. A man who says he cannot afford to be sentimental has usually done the sum while before he announces the total. I only did not think he would announce it in the forecourt with the cake already cut. That was Miss Pruett's touch, I fancy. She has a taste for an audience. You knew her. Everyone at Coombe knows Miss Millicent Pruett. She was used to have me to her card evenings, when she wanted a fourth who could be relied upon to lose gracefully and admire the room. There was no venom in it, only a clear-eyed, level accounting, and Godwin found he preferred it to any denunciation. She did not want Mr. Vale, you understand. Not particularly. She wanted him because he was mine, and a thing is worth more to her the instant it belongs to someone smaller. I do not say it to make myself pitiable. I say it because you asked, and because you look like a man who has been lied to enough for one lifetime and might be glad of a plain answer for a change. Godwin looked at her across the swaying carriage for a long moment. The rain had soaked a dark line along her hem and plastered a strand of hair to her wet cheek, and she made no move to mend either, and met his gaze without dropping her own, and it came to him with the force of something remembered from a former life that he had not, in 11 years, been spoken to in exactly this manner, as a man and not as a rank, as a thing to be told the truth to, and not a fortune to be flattered or a power to be placated. He had built his whole guarded self upon the certainty that no one alive did the one and refrained from the other. And here, dripping and dispossessed, and owning nothing in the world but a grey gown and a returned ring, was a parson's niece doing precisely that, and asking nothing back for it. And what will you do now, at Coombe, when you have brought your aunt her flowers back? Do? She considered it with the same steadiness she gave to everything, as though her own ruin were a sum to be worked rather than wept over. My uncle has a small living and a large heart and no money at all, and I have been a charge upon both these 6 years, since my father died. I had thought marrying Mr. Vale would lift the charge from them. That plan being spoilt, I shall write letters, I expect, and find a situation, a companion to some old lady, or a governess to some young one, in a house where nobody has heard of this morning. I am not afraid of work, Your Grace, and I am past being afraid of pity. Between the two I dare say I shall manage very tolerably. She said it lightly, but Godwin, who had spent his life learning to hear what was left out of a sentence, heard the loneliness folded quietly inside the courage of it, and it moved him more than any complaint could have done. You are a strange sort of woman, Miss Vickery, he said. So I am frequently told, and never as a compliment. But you may mean it however you like. I have given up minding. She drew the rug closer. May I ask you something in return for all my plain answers? You need not give me a plain one. I shall know if you don't. You may ask, why did you come after me? And do not say the rain, or the arithmetic, for you had settled your ditch and could have been halfway to Atholt in comfort, and instead you turned your carriage down the low road to walk it at a foot-pace behind a woman you have never spoken to. A duke does not do that for a stranger without a reason. I am not fishing, Your Grace. I am only a person who has had one large surprise this morning and would rather not be handed another without warning. It was the most direct question anyone had put to Godwin in years. And it landed squarely in the sealed room he kept behind everything, the room with Cordelia Aldingham's name on the door, and for a moment he could not answer it at all, not because he did not know the answer, but because he had only just, in this rocking carriage, begun to suspect what it was. And the suspicion frightened a man who had spent 11 years and a great deal of himself ensuring that nothing should ever frighten him again. I do not perfectly know, he said, which was true, and rarer on his lips than she could have guessed. I saw you set the ring down. I have watched a great many people lose a great many things, Miss Vickery, and I have watched them all clutch and rage and bargain for what was already gone. You set it down and named it a thing that never fit and walked out into the road, and I found I could not. He stopped and chose the smaller truth over the larger one, because the larger one was not yet fit to be said aloud even to himself. I found I could not let you walk 7 miles in the rain and count myself a decent man. Let that be the reason. It is very nearly the whole of it. Very nearly, she repeated, watching him, and did not press for the remainder, which he was obscurely grateful for and obscurely disappointed by at once. She turned her face to the streaming window, and the grey light lay along her cheek, and she said, more to the glass than to him, "It is a great deal more than I was offered by the man who meant to marry me. He would not walk to the end of the drive for me by the end. So I shall take your very nearly, your grace, and be glad of it, and not haggle over the rest." The carriage crested the shoulder of the down, and below them the valley opened grey and rain-swept, the huddle of a village and a squat church tower showing faint through the weather, Coombe and the end of the drive, and whatever cold homecoming waited at the parson's door. Godwin looked at it. And then he looked at the woman across from him, at the wet strand of hair and the drowned white flowers and the level, unflattering, unafraid eyes, and he understood, with the quiet dismay of a man watching a foundation he had thought bedrock begin very slightly to shift beneath him, that he did not want the road to end. He had come out this morning to settle a matter of drainage and be gone by noon, guarded and untouched as he had been for 11 years, and he was going to arrive at Coombe a subtly altered man, and he could no more look away from the cause of it than he could have called the rain to the sky. The horses started down the long hill toward the village, and Godwin, who had ordered his whole life around the principle that he would never again let a woman's face become necessary to him, sat forward in his seat so as to see hers a little longer, and did not once take his eyes from it. The rain decided it in the end, though neither of them would afterward own that it had been the rain. Godwin had made his offer twice already, once in the flat, courteous words a man uses to a stranger on a road, and once again, when those had glanced off her like water off slate, in fewer and rougher words than he had meant to spend, because he had heard, to his own alarm, a note of pleading trying to enter his voice and had crushed it into brusqueness instead. Both times Malona Vickery had refused him. She had refused him without a tremor of the temptation he had counted upon, thanking him as gravely as though he had offered her a chair at a supper she did not wish to attend, and then she had made as if to walk on into the wet. It was the down that overruled her. The pewter sky broke properly across the shoulder of the hill, and the scattered coins of rain became a grey wall of it in the space of a dozen heartbeats, and a woman in thin grey stuff cannot argue with a cloudburst any more than she can argue with a magistrate. "I will take shelter from the weather," she said at last, raising her voice only enough to carry over the drumming of it on the carriage roof, "because it would be a foolish sort of pride that let me take a fever to spite a rain shower. But I will not be taken to Coombe, your grace, and I will not be beholden. Set me down where the road forks, and I will make my own way when this has passed." "You will drown at the fork," Godwin said. "Then I will drown near enough to walk from," she answered, and got into the carriage. She sat opposite him with her wet skirts gathered close so that not a thread of them should touch the seat's leather, as though even the cloth of her had resolved to be no trouble to anyone. The little white posy at her breast had gone to sodden ruin, the petals browning already, and she did not pluck it off and cast it out of the window as another woman might have done to be rid of the morning's evidence. She let it be. Godwin found he could not stop his eyes returning to it, that small drowned emblem of a celebration that had turned to ash before the cake was cut, and he made himself look instead at the streaming glass and failed, and looked back at her. "You are staring at my flowers," she observed not unkindly. "I beg your pardon. You needn't. They are worth staring at, in their way. A quarter of an hour ago they were the freshest thing in that whole forecourt." She glanced down at them without self-pity, as a naturalist might consider a specimen. "My aunt pinned them on this morning. She rose at 5 to gather them, because she had no money to buy any, and I have not yet decided how I am to tell her that her early rising was wasted. That is the only part of the day that grieves me, if you wish to know." The rest of it I shall be glad of by Mike Almers. Godwin had sat across the bays from ambassadors who lied more clumsily than that woman told the truth. He said, because he could not help it. You do not weep. I have not the leisure for it, she said. Weeping is a thing you do when someone is by to be moved by it. There is no one by. She turned her level look full on him, and there was in it no reproach and no flattery and no calculation whatever, only a plain and rather tired honesty. You are by, of course. But I do not think you are the sort of man one weeps at, your grace. I think you would find it in poor taste. He had spent 11 years cultivating precisely that reputation, and had never once heard it named aloud as a kindness. He did not know what to say to her, and so he said nothing, and the carriage swayed on down the flooding lane while the ford at the bottom of the hill, he could see it now through the murk, brown and rising, put an end to the question of where she might be set down. No horse would take that water tonight. Brill's face appeared streaming at the forward glass with the news Godwin had already read for himself. The Malcolmby Arms stood not half a mile back at the crossroads, and there was nothing else this side of the swollen brook that a Christian would ask a lady to enter. The inn then, Godwin said, until the waterfalls, and saw her mouth tighten, and understood that she had grasped before he had what the inn on such an afternoon was certain to contain. The yard of the Malcolmby Arms was a churn of mud and steaming horseflesh and running ostlers, and ranged along its wall, hoods up and wheels mired, stood 4 or 5 carriages Godwin knew at a glance, for he had passed them not 2 hours since drawn up along the yew hedge at Harefield. The whole fine flower of the wedding party that was to have been a wedding had fled the same storm to the same roof, and were even now, he did not doubt, drying their silks at the parlour fire and consoling themselves for the spoilt afternoon with the inn's best sherry and the choicest recollections of the morning's sport. He handed Malona down himself before Brill could reach her, and felt through his glove that her hand was cold and perfectly steady. You need not go in among them, he said low. I will have a private room got ready, and you may sit apart until the ford falls. And have it said the Duke of Otholt hid a jilted parson's niece in a back parlour like a thing he was ashamed of. She shook her head, and a little water ran from the ruin of the posy. No, I have done nothing this day to be hidden for. I will sit by the fire like anyone else who was caught in the rain, and if the sight of me spoils their sherry, that is a grief they may learn to bear as I am learning to bear mine. And she went in through the low door with her chin at that same impossible level, and Godwin, against every instinct of 11 prudent years, followed her. The parlour fell quiet by degrees as she crossed it, the way a room quiets when a thing walks into it that no one has prepared a face for. Millicent Pruett sat nearest the fire in her rose silk, a little steamed and rumpled now, but no less handsome for it, with a glass in her hand and Crispin veil at her shoulder, and, ranged about her, the half-dozen of her particular allies, among them a thin, high-nosed woman Godwin took for a Lady Sowerby, one of those creatures who attach themselves to a rising fortune and earn their keep by laughing at its jokes. It was this Lady Sowerby who found her tongue first. "Why, Miss Vickery," she said in a voice pitched with beautiful precision to reach every corner of the room, "on foot in all this weather. And here we were told you had gone home to Coombe. But of course one forgets, Coombe is a long way to go on nothing at all." A ripple of amusement went round the fire. "You must be quite exhausted, my dear. Do sit. No, not there, that chair is engaged. Perhaps by the door, where you'll not drip on the good carpet." "She'll take no hurt from a wetting," said Crispin Vale, emboldened, and Godwin watched the young man reach for the cruelty the way a boy reaches for a stick to poke at something already down. "Miss Vickery's used to the weather. That gown's seen a deal of it, I dare say. Same grey stuff she wore at the assembly in the spring, if I've an eye, and at Christmas, and I shouldn't wonder if we don't see it again come next Christmas, for it wears wonderfully well." Millicent Pruett laughed behind her hand, and the little court laughed with her. And the innkeeper's wife by the taps looked at the floor. Malona Vickery did not sit by the door. She stood where she was, in the middle of the warm, bright room, with the water running off her hem, and she let the Lotta run its course as one lets a shower run its course, without flinching from it. When it had spent itself, she looked not at Lady Sowerby, who had aimed the arrow, but at Crispin Vale, who had loosed the second. "It has worn wonderfully well," she agreed, in that same soft and level voice, "and it has cost me nothing new in 3 years, which is more than can be said, Mr. Vale, of the coat you are standing up in. I hope with all my heart it wears as long, for both our sakes, since I understand it, too, was bought upon Mr. Pruett's account, and a man ought to have some lasting good of a debt he means another to pay." She let that sit in the silence a moment, gentle as a hand laid flat. "There. Now we have each of us said an unkind true thing, and I find I have no taste for a second helping. I will stand here by the fire and dry, and trouble no one, and when the water falls I will go." The room did not laugh this time. Godwin saw the colour climb Crispin Vale's neck above the celebrated coat, saw Lady Sowerby's high nose lift and her mouth work and find nothing worth the risk of saying, saw Millicent Pruett's fan come up to hide a smile that had gone thin and fixed. And he understood, standing in the doorway with the rain at his back, that the girl had done it again, had disarmed a whole roomful of her betters not by matching their malice, but by declining, with perfect courtesy, to be smaller than they wished her. It was a thing he had never in his life known how to do. He had answered cruelty with cruelty all his days and called it strength, and here was a penniless woman in a wet grey gown showing him, without the least intention of instructing anyone, that there was a colder and cleaner fire than the one he had warmed his hands at for a decade. He might have left it there. She had won her own ground and asked for no champion, and a wiser man would have kept to the doorway and let her keep it. But Lady Sowerby, stung and unwilling to lose the field, drew breath for another sally. "Well, I'm sure, if we are all to be lectured on our debts by a girl who hasn't a—" And Godwin discovered that he had crossed the room. "Madam," he said. The one word in that voice did to the parlour what the crossing of the forecourt had done 2 hours before. Lady Sowerby's sentence died half-born. Every face turned to him, and every face changed as it turned, for these were people who read rank the way a sailor reads weather, and here was weather indeed. Godwin did not raise his voice. He had never in his life needed to. "Miss Vickery came to shelter from the rain, as you did," he said, "in my carriage, as it happens, for I would not leave a lady on the road in such a storm, and I had thought that a thing every person in this room would understand without its being explained. I see I was mistaken in some of you." He let his glance travel the fire unhurried, and watched them each in turn find something to look at that was not his face. "She has asked nothing of anyone here, which is a good deal more than most of you can say of one another. I would take it as a courtesy if she were let alone to dry in peace." He paused, and the pause was worse than any word. "I am not, as a rule, a man who asks for courtesies twice." No one spoke. Crispin Vale had gone the colour of tallow, and was studying the fire irons with great attention. Millicent Pruett lowered her fan and produced a smile of such radiant, effortful graciousness that Godwin nearly admired the labour of it. "Your grace is all consideration," she said. "Of course Miss Vickery must have the fire. Sowerby, my dear, do make room." And the little court rearranged itself with a great rustling of relief, and the danger passed over the parlour like the storm passing over the down, and the talk crept back by inches, subdued now, careful, giving the woman in grey a wide and unaccustomed berth. Godwin did not sit among them. He took his hat and gloves to the deep window embrasure at the far end of the room, where the water sheeted down the diamond panes and the noise of the fire did not reach, and after a moment he had not asked her. He had only stood there and left the space beside him unfilled. Malona Vickery came and stood in it too, a little apart, holding her cold hands out toward the grey light as though there were warmth in it. "You should not have done that," she said quietly, so that only he should hear. He had expected thanks, or the pretty confusion of a woman overwhelmed by a duke's regard, and had braced himself to be wearied by it. He was not prepared to be scolded. "I beg your pardon? You should not have done it." She kept her eyes on the streaming glass. "I had them, your grace. It was a small thing, and it was mine, and I did not need it done for me, and now every soul in that room will remember not that I answered Mr. Vale, but that the great Duke of Otholt stood up for the parson's niece. And by Sunday it will be a very interesting story with my name in the wrong part of it." She said it without heat, almost gently, the way one corrects a child who has broken a thing while meaning to help. "You have spent a great deal of your name on me this afternoon, and I have not asked you for a farthing of it, and I do not know how I am ever to pay you back. which is the one debt in the world I cannot bear to carry. I did not do it to be repaid, he said. I know you did not, she said. That is what troubles me. And she turned her head and looked at him then, full and steady, and Godwin, who had faced down parliaments and creditors and a marquess with a larger fortune, who had schooled his own heart into a locked and orderly ledger and kept it locked 11 years against precisely this, found that he could not look away from her, and did not wish to, and was afraid of both discoveries at once. You are not what they say you are, she went on low. They say you are cold, but a cold man does not turn his carriage down the low road in the rain for a woman he has never spoken to. I have wondered, this last half hour, what it cost you to become the thing they think you, and whether you would even now remember how to be otherwise, if someone gave you leave. She looked back at the glass. That is an impertinence, and I ask your pardon for it. I am tired, and I have left off minding my tongue. It is a fault my aunt despairs of. Godwin stood very still. The rain ran the pans between them, the low talk murmured at the far end of the room, and he was aware that his heart was doing the thing it had promised never to do again, the slow insistent knocking at the bricked door, and that he had not the smallest wish to make it stop. He ought to give her some smooth ducal nothing and end the conversation and be a wiser man, he heard himself say instead. No one has given me leave in a very long time. Then I am sorry for it. Malona said simply and meant it. He could see that she meant it, and asked him for nothing further. He looked at the wet ruin of the posy still pinned at her breast, and at the level chin, and at the cold hands held to a light that had no heat in it, and he understood, with a plain and terrible clarity that 11 careful years fell away before, that he did not want the ford to fall. He wanted the brown water to keep rising, wanted the rain to hold till morning, wanted this narrow window and this impertinent, unbowed, wholly truthful woman kept exactly where they were, and the discovery frightened him more than any loss ever had. Because a man cannot lose what he has never let himself hold, and he had just, without meaning to, begun to hold something. He turned his face to the glass so that she should not read it there, and found that his voice, when he trusted it at last, had gone unaccountably rough. Tell me about your aunt, he said, who rose at 5 to gather flowers, and he stood at the window with the storm at the panes and listened to her, and dreaded, as he had not dreaded anything in 11 years, the moment the water should fall and this be over. She told him, and he listened as a man listens who has forgotten how, standing half-turned to the glass with the rain crawling down it, so that she spoke to his profile and to the storm at once and did not seem to mind the strangeness of it. Her aunt was a Mrs. Bligh, widow of a curate, who had taken Malona in at 11 when the fever carried off both her parents in a single autumn and left a merchant's small fortune to be swallowed by a merchant's larger debts. There had been a house in Bath once, she said, with a good knocker and a girl to do the fires. There had been a pianoforte. There had been, she supposed, a future of the ordinary comfortable kind that no one thinks to be grateful for until it is gone. And then there had been the debts and the auction, and a woman she had met perhaps twice standing in a cold hall and saying, quite kindly, that of course the child must come to her, though the good Lord knew how they were to manage. And did you manage? The Duke asked. We managed, Malona said. My aunt taught the neighbourhood's daughters their scales and their French verbs for 1 the hour, and I turned her collars and let out her hems and learned that a joint of mutton, treated with respect, will feed 2 women 4 days and make a broth on the 5th. I do not tell you this to be pitied, your grace. I tell you because you asked, and because I have found that people who are ashamed of their circumstances are generally supposing that their circumstances are the most interesting thing about them. And I would rather not make that mistake. She paused, and he heard the smile come into her voice before he turned his head to confirm it. Also I am hungry, and hunger has always made me honest. It is a great inconvenience in a ballroom. Then it is fortunate, he said, that we are not in a ballroom. He had not meant it to sound as it sounded. He watched the words reach her and saw her look away, down at the guttering candle, and a faint colour come up under the cold of her cheek, and he thought, with the same plain terror as before, that he would give a good part of Otholt to be a man who could say such a thing and mean nothing by it. He had been such a man once. He had a dim memory of being easy, of laughter that cost nothing, before the thing 11 years gone had taught him what laughter could be made to cost. He did not speak of it. But he found, standing at that window, that he wanted to, and wanting to was a stranger who had let himself in while the door stood open, and Godwin did not know how to put him out again, nor he was beginning to fear whether he wished to. The inn had settled into the long tedium of the stranded. At the fire, the two commercial travellers had fallen to a game of cards. The fat mother had got her children asleep at last across two settles, and at the good end of the room, where the landlord had brought the second-best candles and a bottle he plainly hoped would be paid for, Miss Millicent Pruett held her small court and watched the Duke of Otholt stand a whole quarter hour at a window talking to a girl in a mended pelisse, and did not like what she saw. He was aware of her watching. He had been aware of Millicent Pruett watching him for the better part of a season, the way a man grows aware of a draught in a house, not painfully, but constantly, and with a settled wish to find the crack and stop it. Otholt, she called now, in the bright carrying voice that had been trained to carry. You will take a chill, brooding by that glass. Come and be sensible. Mr. Danby has the most diverting account of the assembly at Harrogate. Do come and hear how they dance in the north. A small laugh went round her end of the room, obedient as a bell-pull. Though I dare say Miss Vickery, is it, finds northern manners more to her taste. One hears they are wonderfully unaffected up there. Wonderfully plain, the word was chosen. He knew it was chosen. He had spent a day watching people choose their words at him and had grown expert in the small cruelties that dress themselves as pleasantries, plain. It was meant to land on the pelisse and the mended glove and the flowers gone to ruin, and to invite the room to see them, and it did its work. Heads turned, the Clares glanced up, the fat mother woke enough to look. Godwin felt something cold and orderly in him, the old ducal machinery of the setting down, and he had half opened his mouth to use it. A word from him would flatten Millicent Pruett like a scythe through barley, and part of him wanted the pleasure of it. But Marlona spoke first, and she did not raise her voice at all. I have never been north, Miss Pruett, she said, but I have observed that plainness frightens some people a great deal, and I have never quite understood why. A plain loaf keeps a house alive through a hard winter, when the sugar work has all been eaten and forgotten by 12th night. I have always thought I would rather be bread than spun sugar. It is a lower ambition, I know, but one is not sick of it by morning. There was a silence of exactly the right length. One of the commercial travellers gave a short bark of laughter and turned it hastily into a cough. Miss Pruett's smile did not move, which was how Godwin knew the shot had gone home. A smile that stays too still is a wound holding its breath. And the Duke of Otholt, who had not laughed in company in longer than he cared to reckon, felt the thing rise in his chest and had the devil's own work to keep it from his face, and did not entirely succeed. So that when Millicent Pruett's cold eyes flicked to him for support, she found her Duke looking not grave, not lofty, not hers, but delighted and at her expense. Bread, Miss Pruett said, with a little laugh like ice cracking, how droll, and turned back to Mr. Danby and the dieting north, and did not look at the window again. Godwin looked at Marlona. You did not need me, he said low, so that it went no further than the glass between them. No, she agreed, but it was kind of you to be ready. I saw you get ready. She looked up at him then, direct as she had been direct from the first, and something in the look undid another button of the thing he kept fastened over his heart. You must not fight my battles, your grace. If you fight them, they become your battles, and then everyone will say I have set my cap at a duke to hide behind, and they would be half right, which is the worst kind of right to be. I have very little in the world, but what I have is that no one can say I bought it. I should like to keep that. It is nearly all I have to keep, and if I should wish to give you a great deal more than you have, he said. He had not planned the words, they arrived, and he heard them in the room, and could not call them back, and was not sure, in the half-instant after, that he wished to. She went still. The candlelight moved on her face. When she answered, it was gently, and it cut him cleaner than any of Millicent Pruett's hond pleasantries. Then I should ask you why, Marlona said. And I should not accept an answer that a kind man gives a cold girl at an inn, because the ford is up and the night is long and pity is easier than sitting with one's own thoughts. I have been given things out of pity, your grace. They have a taste. One learns it. She drew the ruined posy from her breast, looked at it a moment, the aunt's 5 o'clock flowers drowned, and set it very carefully on the sill between them, as though laying something to rest. I would rather have nothing at all, she said, than something with that taste. He did not answer at once. He could not. The honesty of her had gone into him like cold water into a man too long beside a fire, and it hurt. And it was the first thing in 11 years he had felt cleanly, without the old machinery turning it to something safe. He thought of the woman 11 years gone who had smiled at him across exactly such candlelight and had wanted, it transpired, the title and the 12,000 a year, and not the man inside the coat at all, and who had told him so at the last with a laugh, and how he had built brick on patient brick, a house with no windows to keep such laughter out, and had lived in it, and had told himself it was a fortress and not a grave. And here was a girl in a mended pelisse laying a dead flower on a windowsill and refusing his fortune to keep the one small thing that could not be bought. And he understood that she had, without knowing it, described the exact wound of his life, and named the only cure for it in the same breath. "You are the first person in a very long while," he said, and had to stop and begin again. "The first, I think, who has told me she does not want what I have. Do you know how that sounds to a man in my position? It sounds like the only true thing anyone has said to me since I came into the title." "Then your position is much to be pitied," she said, "and I begin to see why you do not laugh." "I laughed just now." "You did." She smiled, and it reached her eyes, and the storm behind it seemed for a moment a smaller thing. "You should do it oftener, Your Grace. It quite spoils your reputation, and I think your reputation could bear the spoiling." He wanted, with an intensity that alarmed him, to take her hand. It lay on the sill an inch from the drowned flowers, cold. He knew it would be cold. Chapped a little at the knuckle where the glove was worn through, and he wanted to cover it with his own and warm it, and keep it warmed for the rest of a life he had not, until this hour, imagined sharing with anyone. He looked at the hand. She saw him look. Neither of them moved. And the not moving was louder than any word in the room. The rain ran down the black glass, and the candle leaned in a draught, and the space between his hand and hers held the whole of what he did not yet dare to say, and held it so charged that when the landlord's boy dropped a scuttle of coals by the fire they both started as though a shot had gone off. The moment let go of them. Malona laughed, unsteadily, and pressed her cold hand for an instant to her own cheek instead. And the Duke of Otholt turned to the room to master his face and found Millicent Pruett watching, and knew from the stillness of her that she had seen, not the words, she was too far to hear the words, but the not moving, the inch of charged air over a drowned posy, which told her everything the words would have. Her eyes went from Malona's face to his and back, and did their sum, and he saw her arrive at the total and put it away somewhere behind the cold smile for later use. He had lived long enough among such people to read the whole intention in a single look, and the look said, as plain as if she had crossed the room and spoken it, not her, anyone but her, and if the getting rid of her wants doing, then it shall be done. He should have felt the old cold at that. Instead, he felt only a great unwillingness to let the night end, and put this woman back on a road he could no longer bear to think of her walking alone. "The Ford will fall by morning," he said to Malona, quietly. "And you mean to go on to your aunt's, and I mean—" He stopped. He had never in his life said the next thing to anyone, and it came out plainer than a duke's words were meant to come. "I find I do not wish the Ford to fall. I told myself an hour ago that was a folly of the storm. It is not the storm. I want you to know it is not the storm, before whatever tomorrow makes of us. Your Grace." "Godwin," he said. "My name is Godwin. No one has used it since my mother died. I should like to hear it in a voice that wants nothing of me." She looked at him a long moment, and he watched her weigh it. The risk of it, the drop below it, the taste of pity she had learned and would not swallow, and then she gave him carefully, as one gives a thing that cannot be taken back, "Godwin," once, quietly. And the sound of his own name in her mouth went through the 11-year wall of him and out the other side, and he knew that whatever it cost, and it would cost, he was not going to be able to be a wiser man about this after all. They talked on, low at the window, while the inn slept around them and the candles burned down and the rain thinned at last to a whisper of her aunt, of the boys she taught their letters, of a hen named Bishop who would not lay of the book she had read 4 times because it was the only one. She had a way of finding the comic seam in a hard thing and drawing it out gently, so that the poverty she described stopped being pitiable and became, in her telling, merely the weather one had been given to walk in, and Godwin, who had for 11 years mistaken solemnity for depth, discovered in her the thing he had lost the trick of, which was that the truest courage often wears the face of a jest. He asked her once whether she was never afraid of the road, of the winters, of the narrowing years, and she considered it honestly, as she considered everything, and said that fear was a lodger she had learned to keep to one room of the house, and that she did not let into the kitchen where the real living was done. He turned the answer over long after. He thought it the wisest thing he had heard spoken in a decade of drawing rooms full of clever people saying nothing, and he told her, haltingly, a little more than he had told anyone, of a brother dead young and a father who thought grief a weakness and a house full of people who wanted the Duke and had never once wanted Godwin, and she did not pity him, which was the whole miracle of her. She only listened, and once, when his voice caught, she did the thing he had not dared to do himself. She laid 2 cold fingers, for the space of a breath, on the back of his hand where it rested on the sill, and took them away again before either of them could call it more than kindness. And it was the single most defended and most reckless thing that had ever been done to him, and he carried the ghost of it on his skin for the rest of the night. Toward 2 the landlord came round to say the water was going down faster than looked for, that the ford might be passable by first light, and the party had best snatch what sleep they could, for the gentleman at the good end wished an early start. Malona rose, and the drowned posy stayed on the sill, and she looked at it and did not take it, and Godwin understood that she was leaving something behind on purpose, and that he was meant to understand it, and that he did. "Good night, Godwin," she said low, and went to the settle the landlord's wife had made up for the women, and did not look back, because looking back was a thing that could be seen and remarked, and she was careful with the little she had. He did not sleep. He stood at the window a long while after the last candle, but his own had gone out, the drowned flowers pale on the black sill under his eye, and turned over in his mind with a hope he had thought long dead and now found merely buried. How a man in the morning might contrive to travel a humble curate's widow's road that did not lie on his way at all, and by what honest words he might offer, without insult, the whole undreamed future to a woman who would sooner walk than be pitied, and at the good end of the room, in the dark, Millicent Pruett lay wakeful too, and he did not need to see her to feel her thinking, and the thing between them that had begun as a draught had hardened, in the space of one storm-bound night, into something with edges, so that even as his heart lifted toward the morning, some older, colder wisdom in him whispered that a woman like that does not lose a duke to a mended pelisse without first making very sure the pelisse is torn past mending, and that whatever she meant to do, she would do it before Malona Vickery was safe, and would make it look, to all the world, like the truth. The ford fell in the night, as fords do, the brown water sliding back off the stones toward morning until a man might have walked the crossing dry-shod by the time the cocks began, and Godwin, who had told himself in a dozen tempers that he would be gone by first light and trouble Coombe no further, was still at Coombe when the light came. He had taken the better of the 2 rooms the anchor could offer, and had lain awake in it listening to the rain give over, and had risen before the house to stand at the low window with the whole of the evening on him like a warmth he did not trust and could not put down. He had no honest business to keep him. He invented some. There was a lamed leader that wanted looking at, and a letter he might write to his steward at Otholt, and a matter of the toll on the Coombe road that a duke might reasonably wish to understand before he passed along it. And each of these he laid before himself gravely, one after another, the way a man lays out cards he already knows will not save the hand. And none of them was the reason he sent his coachman to walk the horses another hour and put on his own coat and went out into the washed and dripping morning to climb the lane toward the parsonage. She was at the gate when he came to it, in the grey gown gone stiff at the hem where the mud had dried, cutting the beaten heads aloft the last of her aunt's asters with a pair of blunt kitchen scissors, and she looked up him across the low wall with no surprise in her face at all, which undid him more than surprise would have. He had lain awake half rehearsing the courtesies of a leave-taking. He found, standing there with his hat in his hand, and the wet privet soaking his sleeve, that he did not want to take his leave, that the plain fact of her, upright in a dead garden with scissors in her reddened hand, had become in the space of one storm-bound night the thing his eye went to first in any place that held her, the way it had once gone to another face in another year, before he had bricked that door and thrown away the key. He had sworn he would never again let a woman's face become necessary to him. He stood at Malona Vicary's gate and understood that he had broken the oath days ago on a wet road, and only now troubled to notice. "You have not gone," she said. It was not a reproach. It was very nearly, though she would have died before she owned it, a question with hope in it. "The horse is lame," he said. "Your horses are the best in the county, I should think," said Malona, "and none of them lame. But I will let you keep it, your grace, since you have gone to the trouble of a lie, and a man does not lie except to spare somebody, generally himself." She set the scissors down on the wall. For a moment the level eyes met his and held. And the whole quiet garden seemed to lean in around that look, and he was near, nearer than a wiser man would have stood, near enough to have taken the reddened hand from the cold stone had he let himself, and he did not let himself, and she did not lift it. And the not touching hummed in the air between them like a struck glass, and it was, he thought afterward, the last clean minute either of them was to have for a long while. For it was into that minute that the carriage came. He heard it before she did, the crack of a whip laid on too freely, the jangle of a smart team driven hard up a bad lane by a man who did not care what he did to their mouths, and he turned, and the thing that came round the bend of the Coombe Road was a barouche he knew, its panels the colour of claret, its horses lathered, and in it, under a parasol she did not need on so grey a morning, sat Millicent Pruett in rose silk, with Crispin Vale beside her looking sallow and ill-used, and on the box beside the driver a heavy-shouldered man in the Pruett's livery whom Godwin took, correctly, for something between a steward and a bailiff. Behind the barouche, on a hired hack, came a spare grey person in black profession any man of the county could have read at 40 paces, magistrate's clerk, or a constable, or the two officers in one, come out from the county town on a matter grave enough to be worth the ride. They had come for her. Godwin knew it in his spine before a word was spoken, and he saw Malona know it too, saw the hope go out of her face, and the old level steadiness come down over it like a shutter, and he moved without deciding to, half a pace, so that he stood between the gate and the road. Millicent did not trouble to alight. She surveyed the parsonage, and the dead garden, and the plain woman in it, and the Duke of Otholt with his hat in his hand at that woman's gate, and something moved in her handsome, high-coloured face that was worse than triumph, because it was triumph confirmed. "There," she said to no one and to everyone, folding her parasol with a snap. "You see, Crispin, did I not tell you where we should find her and in what company? I said she would not have gone quietly. Girls of that sort never do. They go to ground, and they wait, and they see what larger fish the muddy water brings them." She turned the great blue eyes upon Godwin and made him a seated bow of exquisite insolence. "Your Grace, I am sorry above everything that you should be here to see this. Truly I am. A man of your consequence, and this creature, but you were not to know. None of us was to know until it was too late for poor Crispin what she is." "And what is she, Miss Pruett?" Godwin said. His voice had gone very quiet and very even, the voice that had ended arguments across committee tables and made stewards go pale, and it did not move Millicent Pruett at all, because Millicent Pruett had come armed. "Thief," she said, and let the word sit in the wet air. "My mother's diamonds, your Grace, the drops and the clasp that my father gave my mother the year I was born, that I was to have worn at my own wedding, went out of the Blue Chamber at Harefield on the very morning that woman made her scene upon our steps. The room was hers to pass. She had run of the house as poor Crispin's intended, more's the pity, and by noon the case was empty. My father would have hushed it, for the family's sake and for hers, and put it down to a servant, and let the matter lie. But I could not let lie. She laid her gloved hand upon her breast with the air of one performing a painful duty. It was not the diamonds. Diamonds may be bought again. It was that she is loose among honest people wearing an honest face, and I could not sleep for the thought of it. So I have brought Mr. Coble. She inclined her head toward the grey man on the hack. "Who is deputed by the magistrate, and we will have her things searched here this morning, before witnesses, and then we shall know." "You will not touch my niece's things," said a new voice, thin and shaking, and Godwin saw that the parsonage door had opened and a small elderly woman had come out onto the step, an apron still tied over her Sunday best, her face grey as ash. This, he understood, was the aunt, Mrs. Bligh, the widow who had risen at 5 to gather flowers for a wedding that never was, and she came down the path with her chin working and her hands knotted in the apron, and put herself, all 5 foot nothing of her, between the Berrucci and her sister's child. "She is the honestest soul that draws breath in this parish, and everybody here will swear it. And you are a wicked woman to come to a poor house with such a tale, and I do not care that your father owns the living, I do not care." Aunt Malona had not moved from the wall. She put out one hand and touched the old woman's shoulder, and the touch stopped her as a hand stops a runaway on the green, gently, all at once. "Hoosh now. You will make yourself ill, and it will change nothing. And I will not have you ill on my account before these people." She lifted her head and looked not at Millicent, but at the grey clerk who sat his hired horse with the patient discomfort of a man who has done this office too many times to enjoy it. "Mr. Coble, you have the right to search, I think. If there is a sworn information laid, I will not make you drag me from a doorway like a play at a fair. My box is under the bed in the north room, and there is a work basket on the sill, and a pocket book in the drawer of the press, and those are the only places in the world that are mine. Go and look in them. I will stand here in the garden where everyone can see me and touch nothing while you do." It was said so plainly and with so little of either terror or defiance that even Coble seemed for a moment ashamed of his errand, and Godwin, watching her, felt the old wound him wake and stretch and begin, softly, to speak. He had heard a woman speak reasonably once before, in another cold morning 11 years gone, heard a face he had loved past sense explained to him, with just this same clear unshaken sweetness, why the greater estate and the older title were only prudent, only sensible, why he must not think hardly of her, why a clever woman weighed a thing before she leapt, and he had believed the sweetness because it wore the shape of honesty, and it had cost him, when the truth of it came out at last, more than he had ever let another living soul see. That was the door he had bricked. That was the reason the county called him cold. And now a low, poisoned, patient voice at the back of his own skull, his own voice, wearing the accents of that far-off ruin, began to lay the cards out for him one by one, cool as Millicent Pruett herself. A woman ruined in public who wept not at all. A woman who refused a duke's carriage twice so gracefully, so unanswerably, that the refusing had drawn him after her the harder. Was that dignity, or was that the finest bait a clever creature ever cast? Plain grey gown, an unfashionable name, a level chin, a whole performance of not wanting, perhaps, before an audience of 40 on a terrace where a rich and guarded duke was known to be standing. He had thought himself the one man in England no woman could take in that way again. And here was a woman who had taken him in exactly that way, if Millicent spoke true, and the diamonds were gone, and the room had been hers to pass. For a moment, one long terrible moment that he was to be ashamed of to the last day of his life. Godwin, Duke of Otholt, said nothing. He stood at the gate with his hat in his hand, and the old cold coming up through him like water through a breach, closing over the warmth of the storm-bound night, glazing his face into the mask the county knew, and he looked at Malona Vickery and did not defend her, and she saw it. That was the worst of it, and he knew it was the worst even as it happened, and could not stop his own face from doing the thing that ruined him. She looked at him across the little garden, across the dead asters and the blunt scissors on the wall, and she watched the shutter come down over the man who had turned his carriage down the low road in the rain, and she understood precisely what it meant, and she did not plead. She did not put out her hand to him as she had to her aunt. She only grew, if it were possible, a very little straighter, and something in her eyes changed and settled and went quiet, the way a lamp is turned down against a long night, and Godwin felt that quieting as a physical blow beneath the ribs. "Well searched or ill-searched," Millicent was saying, pleased. "The county will know the truth of her by nightfall regardless, so I am content, your grace." Malona did not raise her voice. It cut across Millicent's all the same, low and even, and it was addressed to Godwin alone, and it stilled the whole garden. You need not stand there on my account. I am sensible of what it costs a man of your rank to be found at such a gate on such a morning, and I would not have it cost you more. You have been kind to me, kinder than I was owed, and kinder than I shall let myself remember presently, and I thank you for it, and I release you from the whole of it freely, and I ask nothing further then or now. Go home to Otholt. Whatever is found in my box, you were never in it, and no breath of this need ever touch your name. That is the lost service I can do you, and I am glad to be able to do you one. She inclined her head to him, a small, grave, final courtesy, as a woman bows to a stranger leaving a room she does not expect to see him in again. Good morning, your grace. It was so gently done, and so completely, that it stopped his breath. She had looked at his silence and read in it that he doubted her, and rather than beg to be believed, she had gathered up her ruined name and her frightened aunt and her whole imperiled future, and set the Duke of Otholt outside of it, safe, unstained, dismissed. Had made of her own catastrophe a thing she carried alone, so that it should not so much as spatter his boots. No woman had ever in his life tried to spare him at the price of herself. The far-off ruin that he had built his heart around had spared herself at the price of him. He stood at the gate with that difference sounding in him like a bell, and could not, for the life of him, make his tongue move. Coble came heavily down out of the doorway at that moment with something wrapped in a handkerchief in his broad hand, and his grey face was grim. "Was under the lining of the box, ma'am," he said to Millicent, not to Malona, unwilling to look at her. "Sewn behind the paper, like the clasp and the 2 drops, near as I can tell them from the sworn description." He opened the handkerchief, and there they lay in the dull morning light. Catching what little there was of it and throwing it back in hard bright splinters, the Pruett diamonds in Malona Vickery's box behind Malona Vickery's lining, exactly where a thief would have hidden them, exactly where an honest woman never in this world would have thought to look. Mrs. Bligh made a small broken sound and swayed, and Malona caught her and held her up, and looked at the stones in the constable's hand with an astonishment so plain and so total that to Godwin, had Godwin been the man he was a week before, had the old cold not been standing between his eyes and hers like a fog, it must have shouted her innocence to the housetops. But the cold was there, the diamonds were there. And Millicent Pruett, rising now in her barouche with her colour high and her fan going, was saying in a carrying, sorrowful, wholly delighted voice behind the lining, of all the low sly places, "Oh, I am sorry, Crispin, I am so sorry you were ever within a mile of her. Mr. Coble, you will do your office. Your grace, forgive us, forgive me that you were made to witness it. We are all of us the wiser now, and Godwin, Duke of Otholt, feared through 6 counties, master of Otholt and of himself, stood at gate of a country parsonage with his hat crushed in his hand, and looked at the woman he had begun, against every oath he had sworn, to love, being taken by the arm by the grey magistrate's man before her aunt and her God and the whole leaning street, and the diamonds glittered. And the old wound had his tongue, and he said nothing, and he did nothing, and the barouche wheeled about in its own length with a crack of the ill-used whip and rolled away down the Coombe Road in triumph, and the constable turned Malona toward the town and the assizes and ruin. And she went with him without a backward look, upright to the last, carrying her aunt's weeping and her own broken name and the Duke's silence all together in her 2 hands as though they weighed nothing at all. And it seemed, in that grey and dreadful morning, at that trampled little gate under a sky that had at last done raining, that the cruel had won everything there was in the world to win. She stood a moment in the low doorway with the morning behind her, and the garnet cross lay where it had fallen out of her bundle onto the deal table, small and red and damning in the thin sun, and the whole room looked at it and then at her, and the Duke of Otholt said nothing. That was the thing he would remember, not the cry Millicent Pruett had given when the cross was missed from her travelling case, high and wounded and well-timed. Not the maid's busy hands turning out the mended linen while the commercial travellers craned, and the fat mother drew her waking children against her skirts. Not even the small hard clink of garnet on wood that had turned the room against a penniless girl in the space of a breath. He would remember that Malona had looked at him once directly, in the way she had looked at him from the first, asking nothing, only seeing, and that he had let his eyes go to the cross on the table instead of to her face, and had held them there and had not spoken, and that in the silence a door had opened in him that he had bricked over 11 years before, and through it had come, cold and reasonable and grinning, the oldest lesson of his life. So there was a hand in the jewel case after all. So the tender feeling had a price and a hidden reckoning, as it always had, as Cordelia had taught him it always would. He had stood in an inn yard with his heart knocking like a fool's and let a single winking stone persuade him, for the space of perhaps 4 heartbeats, that he had been played for a fool a second time, and in those 4 heartbeats Malona Vickery had gathered up her turned linen with steady hands, and said, quietly once, to no one and to all of them, I did not take it, and had not said it again, because she had learned long ago that a thing said twice to people who have decided not to believe it only sounds the more like pleading, and she had walked out under the inn's low lintel, and across the wet yard, and out through the gate onto the white road, alone on foot, with her chin level, exactly as she had walked out of Harefield Grange, and he had let her go. He had let her go. The knowledge arrived all at once. The way a wound is not felt in the instant of the blow, but a moment after, and it took the breath out of him. 11 years he had kept the ledger shut and called it wisdom, and the wisdom had come to this, that the one true heart the world had ever shown him had stood 4 feet from him asking to be believed, and he had weighed her word against Millicent Pruett's garnet. And for 4 heartbeats the garnet had won. He put his hand on the door frame. Millicent's voice went on somewhere behind him, warm now with the satisfaction of the vindicated, poor creature. One had tried to be kind to her, one had given her the seat by the fire, and this was the return. And the sound of it, which an hour ago had been merely a draught in the house of his attention, was now intolerable to him. Physically, the way a false note held too long is intolerable. And it was into that silence of his, before he had mustered it enough to turn and do the thing he now knew he must do, though he had no witness for it but her word and his own shamed certainty, that the landlord's boy spoke up. He was a small boy, the pot boy, perhaps 9, with a burnt thumb bound in a rag, and the anxious brightness of a child who has been told all his short life not to speak above his station and is about to do it anyway. He had been carrying in the breakfast ale when the cross was found, and he had stopped by the settle with the jug still in his 2 hands, and now he said, into the warm hum of Millicent Pruett's triumph, in a voice that cracked upward on the last word, but it were the other lady's woman as put it there. The room went still in a different way than it had gone still before. Ned, said the landlord low and warning, coming forward with his cloth, hold your tongue, boy. I seen her, the boy said, and his chin, Godwin noticed. His chin came up, the way another chin had come up in that doorway, and something turned over in the Duke's chest. This morning, when the grey lady were out at the pump washing, that lady's woman there. He did not point. He had been too well trained to point, but his eyes went to the maid, and everyone's eyes followed them. She come to the grey lady's bundle by the settle, and she done something quick with her hand and went off again, and I thought naught of it, only she looked round first to see was anyone by. And I were behind the barrel so she never saw me, and then the cross were lost. That's all, only it weren't the grey lady. She were out at the pump. I seen her out the window the whole while, wringing her stockings. For the length of a slow breath no one moved. The maid had gone the colour of tallow. Godwin turned from the doorframe at last, unhurried, because he had learned 20 years ago that the slower a powerful man moves the louder the room grows around him, and he looked at the maid, a thin, frightened, ordinarily decent-looking young woman with her mistress's cast-off ribbon at her throat, and he said, not loudly, what is your name? She looked at Miss Pruett. That was the whole of it, really, that single flick of the eyes toward her mistress before she would consent to own her own name. And Godwin saw the room see it, saw the fat mother's mouth go flat and the commercial travellers exchange a glance, saw the maid understand too late that she had already answered the only question that mattered. Dawes, your grace, she managed. Susan Dawes. Your grace, I never, the boy's mistook, he's a lying little. He is not lying, Godwin said, and you would do a great deal better not to teach him the trade at this particular moment. Where were you standing when Miss Vickery was at the pump? Our hands worked in her apron. By the settle, your grace, but only to fold my lady's shawl as had slipped. I never went anigh the Grey Lady's things. The Grey Lady's things were on the settle, Godwin said gently, beside the shore. You have just told me you were at the settle. You are not a stupid woman, Mrs. Dawes. Do not make yourself into one for someone else's sake. A mistress who can make you carry her sins will turn you off within the 12-month and never so much as recall your Christian name. I have watched the great use up the small for a long time, and it always ends the same way for the small. Tell me plainly what you were bid to do, and I will see you are not the one who suffers for it. He did not raise his voice through any part of it. He had spent a decade learning to do to a whole council chamber with a level tone what other men could not do with a raised fist, and he turned that instrument now, for the first time in his life, in a good cause, and felt the strangeness of it like a muscle used the right way after long misuse. And Susan Dawes, who had one honest bone left in her and had been miserable about the business since the pump, if the truth were told, began to cry the plain ugly tears of a person who has been made to do a wicked thing against her own grain, and the tears did what her voice had not. She bid me, she said, my lady, last night, after you stood so long at the window with the grey with Miss Vickery, she bid me put the cross among her things this morning and let it be found, and to say naught, and there'd be a sovereign in it and a place kept for me. She said, Dawes drew a wet, wretched breath. She said no one would ever take a poor girl's word over a lady's, and it were only what everyone would believe of such a one in any case, so where was the harm? She said Duke of Otholt of all men would believe it soonest, on account of he'd been served the same trick once himself and never got over it, and a burnt child dreads the fire. She looked up, streaming, at Godwin's still face. Them was her words, your grace. I'm main sorry for it. He had not thought, at his age and in his armour, that a thing could still go through him so, on account of he'd been served the same trick once himself. Millicent Pruett had reckoned his oldest wound as coolly as a card player counts the trumps already played, had laid her whole scheme upon the certainty that the Duke of Otholt could be relied upon to distrust the one honest heart in the room precisely because it was honest, and she had reckoned right, near enough, 4 heartbeats worth of right, a hand's breadth from unforgivably right. He turned and looked at last full at Millicent Pruett, and found her already gathering the ruins of her face into its cold accustomed shape, the smile coming up over the alarm like ice reforming over a stone dropped through it. Otholt, she said, and gave a little laugh, brittle at the edge. You cannot mean to stand there and credit the snivelling of a maid caught out in her own theft, and a pot-boy after a penny. She will say anything now to save her place. It is the commonest thing in the world. I am astonished a man of your judgment. You are astonished, Godwin said, at a great many things this morning. You were astonished to find your cross gone. You were astonished to find it among Miss Vickery's linen. You told the room, Miss Pruett, before your woman had turned out above 2 folds of that linen, that we should look for it wrapped in the grey stocking, and so we did, and so it was. He had not been sure of it until he said it. The memory had lain at the edge of his shamed silence and only now walked forward into the light. But he saw from the sudden fixity of her that it was true, and he saw the room remember it with him. You knew where it was because you had put it there. A woman does not know the wrapping of a stranger's stolen goods before the goods are found. You have been very clever, Miss Pruett. For a whole season and the better part of a night. But cleverness is a candle, and it always burns down to the fingers at the last, and here are your fingers. He let that sit in the room a moment, and then, because the older, colder half of him stirred and offered him her ruin whole and gift wrapped, and because he found, to his own faint surprise, that he did not want it. I will not make a spectacle of you, he said more quietly. You have made spectacle enough this morning, and it has not answered. I will say only this, so that the good people of this room may carry it into the county, which they will, whether I wish it or no, that a lady is a thing you are in your conduct, or a thing you are not. And no quantity of your father's money and no garnet cross in Christendom will purchase you the one you have this morning proved you are not. Good day to you. I do not think we shall meet in a drawing-room again. I shall take care that we do not. There was no laugh from her end of the room now, and no obedient little laugh going round it like a bell-pull, and the silence of exactly the right length that had once belonged to Malona's quiet replies belonged now, wholly and terribly, to Miss Millicent Pruett. and she sat in the middle of it with 2 spots of colour burning on a handsome face and nothing to say, which was, Godwin thought, the first unrehearsed thing he had ever seen her do. The commercial travellers had turned their shoulders to her. The fat mother had drawn her children clear as from a bad smell. Even the maid doors had crept away along the settle, as though the mistress she had ruined herself to serve had become a thing one did not wish to be found sitting near. The Duke of Othold had humbled greater and cleverer people than Millicent Pruett in his time, and felt, always, the cold, clean pleasure of the craftsman. He felt none of it now. He felt only the sick lurch of a man who has watched a bridge give way an instant after he crossed it. He put a sovereign in the potboy's bound and burnt hand, and folded the small fingers over it, and said low, so that only the boy heard, "You told the truth to a room that did not want it, above your station, because it was the truth. That is the whole of courage, and most grown men never manage it once. Do not let anyone teach you it was foolish." And the boy looked up at him with his mouth open, and Godwin found he could not stay for the thanks, because every part of him had turned now toward the white road beyond the gate. And the woman going up it alone in thin grey stuff, who did not know, who was walking on at this moment, believing herself thief and outcast and thrown over twice, believing that even the one man who had asked her to use his name had weighed her word and found it wanting. "Brill," he said, coming out into the yard with his hat unregarded in his hand, and his coachman came off the pump-trough where he had been idling with his pipe and saw his master's face and put the pipe away without being told. "The horses, now, this instant, as they stand. They're not above half-baited, your grace, and the near leaders. Then we go gently and buy him the finest oats in the shire tonight, but we go now." He was at the carriage door before Brill had well got to the heads, and he took it himself as he had taken it once before on another morning that had ended with a grey figure on a pale road, and swung up and leaned out into the thin cold sun. The Coombe Road, the low way. "And Brill, you will not, whatever the near leader thinks of it, let me arrive too late a second time. I have been a great fool once already this morning. I have no wish to make a practice of it before noon. Coombe Road, I," said Brill, who had served the house long enough to hear the whole of a thing in the half of it, and swung up onto the box, and the carriage came round in the narrow yard in a rattle of harness, and a spray of last night's rain from the cobbles, and out through the gate onto the high road. And the inn with its ruined lady and its honest boy fell away behind the hedge. The road ran pale and washed and empty before him, rising toward the shoulder of the down as another road had risen, and Godwin sat forward with both gloved hands on the frame of the open window and watched the verge, and did not tell himself, this time, that it was a small charity, or a thing any decent man would do, or nothing to do with him. He had told himself all those things once on this same errand, and they had been lies of the most cowardly kind, the lies a man tells to keep the ledger shut, and he was done, he found, with the ledger. It had preserved him and impoverished him for 11 years, and this morning it had very nearly cost him the only thing it had ever been worth the keeping to protect. He thought of her setting the ring on the newel post as one lays a coin on a dead man's eyes. He thought of 2 cold fingers laid an instant on the back of his hand at a black window, and taken away before either of them dared call it more than kindness. He thought of "I did not take it," said once level, into a room that had already condemned her, and of how she had not said it twice, and of how he, who had asked her for his own name in a voice that wanted nothing of her, had given her nothing. In the one moment she might have been forgiven for wanting something, but his silence. Then the road bent around a stand of dripping elms, and there she was. She was a long way ahead this time, a small upright figure of grey against the pale rising road, walking steadily with her arms wrapped about herself, not hurrying, not fleeing, only going on, as she plainly meant to go the whole 7 miles and into whatever Qualcomm waited at Coombe, rather than turn and ask a single soul for anything. She did not turn at the sound of the wheels. Of course she did not turn. She had learned twice over now what carriages coming up behind her were worth, and she drew a little nearer the hawthorn to let it pass and kept walking, and the sight of her doing it, unbroken, unbowed, with the whole weight of a false shame on her thin shoulders and her chin still level under it, went into the Duke of Othold and undid the last fastened thing over his heart entirely, so that what was left was only a man, and a great and simple terror of being too late. Slow, he said. No, that was the old word, the coward's word, the word for a man who means to offer a seat and drive on with a clear conscience and the ledger safely shut. He heard himself change it. Brill faster. Bring me level with her, and then stop, whatever comes. Drive on. And the carriage gathered itself under him and came up the pale road at a pace nearly unseemly and wholly unlike him, the harness ringing, closing the white dust between the man who had learned at last what he wanted and the woman walking away who did not know she was wanted at all. And up ahead the grey figure heard, in the hush before the rest of her life, that the wheels behind her were not slowing to pass but quickening to reach her, and she stopped and lifted her level chin and began to turn. It was the smallness of her going that broke him. He had braced somewhere in the frozen centre of himself for a cry, for the pull back of an arm, for the ugly scuffle that would let him tell himself afterward that the woman had been guilty, had struggled, had shown at the last the low blood the county was always so ready to swear was in her. There was none of it. Malona Vickery let the grey man take her by the arm, and turned her feet toward the Coombe Road as quietly as a girl going into prayers, and walked. And the only sound she made in all that trampled morning was the sound of her own boots upon the wet stones, going away. One and then the other, patient, even unhurried, carrying her ruin down the hill as she had carried every other weight of her life, without complaint and without help. And that small, dwindling sound went into the Duke of Otholt where no cry on earth could have reached him, and found the old brick door he had walled a heart behind 11 years before, and struck it, once, like a bell. For he saw, standing frozen at that gate with his hat crushed in his hand, the whole shape of the lie he had let the old cold tell him, saw it entire, all at once, the way a man wakes and knows the dream for a dream. He had let a poisoned voice at the back of his skull persuade him that her calm was a performance and her not wanting a bait, and he had forgotten the one thing no schemer alive would ever have thought to do. The woman who had ruined him 11 years gone had spared herself at his cost, and dressed the sparing up as sense and gone away rich. This woman, with the diamonds glittering false in a constable's hand and the assizes opening before her like a grave, had spent her last free breath not on saving herself but on setting him outside her catastrophe safe unstained, released, had made of her own destruction a thing she would carry alone rather than let it so much as spatter his boots. No guilty creature does that. No clever creature does that. Only a woman who loves a man more than she fears the world does that, and she had done it for him, freely, expecting nothing, with her whole future already lost, and he had stood there, and let her. No, said Godwin aloud, to the empty garden, to the dead asters, to the blunt scissors on the wall, and the word came out of him hoarse and strange, as though a man long dumb had found his tongue. Mrs. Bligh, weeping into her apron on the step, looked up at him with a hatred she was too broken to hide. He did not blame her for it. He set his ruined hat upon his head and went out of that gate and down the lane at a pace that was not a walk and was not yet a run. And he lifted up his voice and roared for his carriage in a tone that had not been heard from the Duke of Otholt since the hour long ago, when he ceased to care enough about anything to raise it. His coachman had walked the horses, as he had been bidden, no further than the foot of the parsonage lane, and the man had them collected and the door flung wide before his master reached them. The Coombe Road, Goodwin said, going up into the carriage without the step, after the constable's party. Spring them. If you overturn us in the ditch, I will thank you for the willingness. Drive. They sprang. The washed morning tore past the glass, the dripping hedges, the swollen ditches silver with the last of the rain, the startled faces of Coombe folk finding a duke's chariot flung down the road at a gallop not an hour behind the barouche. Godwin sat forward with his hand braced against the frame and his whole heart gone out ahead of the horses, praying, which he had not troubled to do in years, praying to overtake a small grey figure walking, before she should be shut into any place from which even a duke could not, that same hour, bring her out. He overtook her within the mile. They were on the long open reach below the church, where the Coombe Road ran straight between its flooded meadows toward the toll and the county town beyond, and there was no mistaking them at any distance, the heavy grey man on his hired hack, the small upright woman walking at his stirrup with her hands folded before her and her head level, going toward the assizes on her own 2 feet as steadily as she did all things. Godwin struck the roof with his fist. The carriage swept up on them and past them and drew across the road at the slant, so that the hack shied and Coble hauled it up swearing, and the Duke of Otholt was down out of the door and standing in the mud of the Coombe road before the wheels had wholly ceased to turn, bareheaded now, the hat left somewhere on the seat, the wind off the wet meadows lifting his hair and his face no longer a mask at all. "Mr. Coble," he said, "you will halt. There has been a great wrong done on this road this morning, and I will not have it carried 1 yard further while I have breath to stop it." "Your Grace." The clerk touched his hat, unhappy, dogged, an honest man doing a hated office. "I've your sworn information laid, and the goods found on her person near enough. I'd oblige you in most things, but I've no discretion in this. She must come before the bench." The goods. Godwin came a step nearer, and his voice dropped into the quiet, even register that had made stewards go pale across the length of England. Only there was a thing running under it now that had never been in it before. "You found the stones sewn within the lining of her travelling box. You said as much. Sewn behind the paper in the last low place a thief would hide them." He held the grey man's eye. "Tell me, Mr. Coble, for you are, I think, an honest man, and I am asking you a plain question before witnesses, the information you carry, the paper sworn before your magistrate. Read it to me. Read me the words in which the theft is charged and the place the stolen goods are said to lie." Coble's honest face changed. He had been an officer of the county too many years not to feel the ground shift under a thing before he could yet name what had moved it. Slowly he drew the folded paper from his breast and unfolded it against the wind and read, in the flat voice of a man reading a summons, and the words, when they came, fell into the wet morning one by one like stones dropped down a well. "The diamonds of Miss Millicent Pruett of Harefield, the clasp and the 2 drops, feloniously taken, and to be found." The clerk's voice slowed and stopped, and went on against its will, concealed within the lining of the travelling box of the said Malona Vicary. There was a silence on the Coombe road then that even the wind seemed to keep. "Sworn," said Godwin softly, before the box was ever opened, describing to the letter a hiding place that no living soul could have known, save the one hand that stitched those stones behind that paper. "A woman does not swear where a thing is hid unless she hid it herself. You have not caught a thief this morning, Mr. Coble. You have been sent to carry one home in her stead." He turned his head, and for the first time since the carriage stopped he looked full at Malona, standing very still at the shied horse's shoulder with her folded hands and her level chin and her eyes gone wide upon his face. And his own face, for all the road to see, came open like a door. "The thief is at the toll gate ahead of us in a claret barouche," he said. "And by God, Mr. Coble, we are going to fetch her back." They fetched her back. It wanted no fetching in the end, for the toll-keeper, a stubborn old fellow who had never in 20 years lifted his gate for any carriage until the penny was paid, be it a duke's or a bishop's, had kept the claret barouche standing at the closed bar in a fury of rose silk and cracking whip, so that when the carriages and the hack came up together the whole party met in a knot at the toll, in full view of the smith who had run out from his forge, and a dozen Coombe folk who had followed on foot, and Mrs. Bligh, who had come the whole way down the hill after her girl, and stood panting and grey against a gatepost with her apron pressed to her mouth. Godwin did not raise his voice for the humbling of Millicent Pruett. He had learned, in a hard school, that the quiet word carries furthest across a silent crowd. He stood in the road with the sworn paper in his hand, and he laid it before them all, the charge that named the hiding place before the hiding place was found. The deposition that could only have been sworn by the one who set the trap, and he watched the high handsome colour drain out of Millicent's face, and something small and cornered come up behind her eyes in its place. She rallied. She was game to the last. She cried out that the girl had confessed the hiding to her, had boasted of it, that it was all a slander got up by a duke bewitched. But the country folk were murmuring now, low and ugly, the way a slow people turn all at once and terribly when at last they see. And it was not Godwin who finished her in the end, but Crispin Vale. The sallow young man had sat throughout in the corner of the barouche like a whipped dog. And now he broke wretchedly all at once, his face in his hands. That he had known that Millicent had taken the case herself from the blue chamber and had her own maid stitch the stones behind the lining the night before, and had laughed and said a plain nobody of a parson's niece would sooner hang than be believed against a Pruett. He had jilted Malona Vickery upon her aunt's own steps to please the Pruetts and their money, and now, snivelling at the Combe Tall before the whole parish, he handed the Pruetts their ruin with the same weak hands. And Millicent Pruett, who had come down the Combe Road that morning in rose silk under a parasol she did not need, was driven back up it before nightfall with the blinds drawn close against the eyes of a county that would not, to the end of her days, forget what it had watched fall to pieces at the toll gate. And the sneering voices that had hunted a poor woman for the crime of being poor were, all of them, at last and utterly silenced. But that was the afternoon's business, and Godwin scarcely marked it. For the moment Coble had heard the maid's part of it, he had let Malona's arm go with a rough gentleness and stepped back and pulled off his hat to her, red to the ears, muttering that he was heartily glad, ma'am, heartily glad, and no man gladder, and Malona had stood free in the road, unclaimed, unaccused, with the false charge falling off her into the mud, and had swayed just once, the only sign of what the morning had cost her, and Godwin had crossed the space between them in 2 strides and put out his hand, and this time not stopped himself. He took her cold hand in both of his. The whole struck-glass humming of every not-touching of the past week rang out at once and went quiet in the plain warm fact of it, her fingers in his, before the toll and the smith and the weeping aunt and the God who had let him come in time. "Miss Vickery," he said, and found that the even voice had deserted him utterly, and let it go. "Malona, I will say this where they can all of them hear it, for you were shamed in the open, and you shall be righted in the open, and I will not do it behind a hedge. An hour ago I stood at your gate and I doubted you. I felt you lied to. I let a wound 11 years old shut my mouth when your whole life hung upon my speaking, and I said nothing, and I let them take you, and I shall carry the shame of that silence to my grave." Her fingers stirred in his. He held them the closer. "There was a woman once who taught me that a sweet reasonable voice may cover a false heart, and I swore after her that I would never again let any woman's face grow needful to me. I kept the oath 11 years, and called it strength, and it was nothing but fear in a colder coat. And then you would not flatter me, and refused my carriage twice on a wet road so plainly that I could not sleep for it. And this morning, ruined, with everything to lose, you spent your last free words not on begging me to believe you, but on setting me free of your trouble, that it might not touch my name. No one has ever tried to spare me at the cost of herself. Not once in all my life until you." His voice broke, and he did not care that it broke, and the country folk about the Tall were silent as a church. "You have undone every wall I built. You have made me a man again who had made himself a stone on purpose, because a stone cannot be broken. I would rather be broken every day of my life at your side than be a whole cold stone another hour without you. That is what you have done to me, and I am not sorry, and I will not take it back." She looked up at him a long moment, level grey eyes wet at last, and searching and terribly honest, and he stood and let her search him to the bottom, for he had nothing left in him now to hide. "You are a duke," she said at length, low, so that it was almost only for him. "And I am a parson's niece in a made-over gown, that was jilted upon her aunt's steps and marched to the toll for a thief within the same week. If you take my hand before these people this morning, out of pity, or out of the shame of your silence, or because a great man cannot bear to have been in the wrong, you will break me kinder than Millicent Pruett ever could, and I would sooner you drove home to Otholt and let me go." Her chin lifted. "I do not want your carriage, your grace. I never wanted your carriage. I want no rescue and no rank and no roof, if that is all it is. I told you once a man does not lie except to spare somebody, so do not spare me now. Tell me true and small, as though there were no dukedom in the world. Is it the man that is asking, or only the great house that cannot abide a stain upon its honour?" "It is the man," said Godwin. "Only the man. There is no dukedom in it at all." And because words had already carried him further than he had ever let words carry him, and because she had asked for truth told small, he did the smallest and truest thing there was. He lifted her cold reddened hand, the hand that had cut dead asters at a gate that morning as though the world were not ending, and he bent his proud head over it there in the mud of the Combe Road, before the toll and the smith and all the leaning parish. And he pressed his mouth to her worn knuckles as gravely and humbly as a poor man might, and did not let it go. And Malona Vickery, who had not wept when she was jilted, nor when she was shamed, nor when the diamonds glittered false in a constable's hand, put her free hand up over her mouth and wept at last, because she was believed, and because she was cherished, and because the future one weak man had thrown away upon her aunt's steps had come back up the Combe Road in a duke's chariot to find her walking, and had got down into the mud to ask her, small and true, for nothing but herself. They were married in the little church at Combe, and not at Otholt, because she asked it, and he had by then learned that what she asked was worth more to him than the whole opinion of 6 counties. Mrs. Bligh gathered the flowers, up before 5 as she had been for the wedding that never was, and this time carried them down a road that ended rightly. And if the county, that had once let a poor woman be marched to a toll gate on a lie, chose now to line that same road 3 deep to see the overlooked parson's niece go up it on the arm of the Duke of Otholt, why, Godwin thought, watching her come toward him level-chinned and steady in the plain grey gown she had refused to give up for anything grander, let them look. Let every sneering face that had scorned her stand bareheaded in the mud and look their fill at what they had thought too low to see. He had been a feared man, and a cold one, guarded long years against exactly this, and counted the guarding now the cheapest bargain of his life, since all it had ever purchased was the empty safety of a stone. Long after, at Otholt, when the great hall was warm with her and the county came to her table for the kindness they had once denied her, he would find her at some window in the last of a winter afternoon, unaware of him, mending or reading or only looking out at the park. And he would stand a moment in the doorway the way he had stood at a country gate on a dripping morning, and let his eye go to her first, as it went to her first in any room that held her, and would go until he died, and then he would cross the room, the once guarded Duke of Otholt, and take the reddened, clever, beloved hand that had cut asters at the edge of ruin, and hold it, plainly, needing nothing further of the world at all, and she would turn and smile up at him as though he were the whole of her good fortune, and neither of them ever once mistook which of the two had been the more richly saved,